Welcome to the Microsoft Security Insight Show. The show streams live at 5 every Wednesday evening on YouTube and Twitch and streamed directly into your ear the following Monday. Hosted by Edward Walton, Andrea Fisher, Rod Trent, and Brody Castle, the Microsoft Security Insight Show provides information, news, and tips on Microsoft security solutions.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you all for joining us today for this live stream event. My name is Adbena, and I'm the Program Manager of the Microsoft Reactor San Francisco. I'll be sharing session resources with you in the chat, but before we begin, I would like to quickly review two items with you, our Code of Conduct and event guidelines. First, please take a moment to review our Code of Conduct. Microsoft Reactor seeks to provide a respectful environment for both our audience and our presenters. We do encourage engagement in the chat, but please be mindful of your commentary, remain professional and on topic. And secondly, our event guidelines. This session is being recorded and will be available on demand through the Microsoft Reactor YouTube channel in about 24 to 48 hours. I'll be sharing the link in the chat for our YouTube channel, and if you have not been on a live stream through YouTube before, please know that you must create an account on YouTube in order to access and interact in the chat. You can set that up right now, and if you're unable to use the chat but have questions, feel free to reach out to us through our social media or meetup. Which brings us to today's session with the Microsoft Security Insight Show. I'm going to bring in our speakers, Chris.
Hello.
Hello there. We have Rod coming in.
Hey, there I am.
Brody.
Hello?
Oh, there we go. He's back.
There we go.
The headset doesn't work. I was working on Teams all day. Shucks. Got a technical support issue.
Shucks.
How's
And Edward is here. Edward, are you here? Can we hear you?
Of course I'm here.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So, hello, everyone. Recorded January 18th, 2023. Good afternoon/evening. I'm going to start with you, Brody. You never know how long you're going to be on. How are you, Brody?
I'm doing well. It has been meeting to meeting to meeting today. It is just not stopped. So I'm really looking forward to this. I'm really looking forward to having Chris on. I was actually just talking to Chris's boss recently too. He was like, "Chris is coming on the show. Like, you guys are going to have a great time with Chris coming on." So that was one of my meetings today. And honestly, it's just been a whirlwind. This whole week's a whirlwind. I got some new projects starting up. I'm leading them, so extra fun. And other than that, I mean, I'm working out in British Columbia this week. We're house sitting.
Oh, nice.
In-laws are out skiing. We're
nice.
We're kind of near. It's called Fairmont Hot Springs.
Oh, beautiful.
And
yeah.
So it's just a great spot, Chris. And so we're just watching. We're watching the dog, watching the house, and so I'm in like a little nook in the basement here. My wife's upstairs. Things are good overall. I'll leave it there since I don't want to beat Edward's time for largest introduction. Edward, how are you doing, my friend? My favorite Edward in the whole wide world.
Sure. What do you want, Brody? No, I'm not going to be a character witness or anything. So there you go. No, I'm all right. I busy this week, more than I have been. Was a little under the weather, but I'm better now. Talked to Rod about something interesting today. Rod, thank you for the insight. I sort of transferred that entire conversation from yesterday until today, and I'll give you some update on how that went, but it went swimmingly. There you go. Cool. And just been doing what I think I told you guys I'm going to do, man. I'm studying. I finished up a couple of things that I'm reading on. Nothing that really is asking me for the sort of certification bound at the moment. This is just professional enhancement, learning about some tech. But I did get an interesting email saying that it's time for me to renew my SC 400. And I'm like, wait a minute, I just did that.
Yeah,
and
that's
like,
yearly. Yeah.
I got a renewal one yesterday. Yeah.
I'm like, so the things I know that I'm due for, you're not sending anything. The things I know I thought I was already good for, but I'm going to do it. I don't want to take any chance. Probably got something to do with Frank. Frank's probably behind us.
Frank's sending you emails. Yeah, I double check before you click on a link.
Yeah, I would. That I do not want to be the brunt of his joke. You will click on anything. But I do have some technical stuff I want to share with our listeners before we get to our guests. But before then, Rod, what have you been doing?
Oh, well, obviously you kind of gave it away. I've been talking to you, so people know about that now. However, I think it's kind of interesting, Brody, just in case I have an extra headset. I don't know if this works and you can
Thank
actually
you.
grab that.
I'm really bad with computers, Rod, so I appreciate you and your authentic wanting to help me. Thank you.
Well,
sir.
for those that don't understand exactly what's going on, prior to the show kicking off live, Brody, we couldn't hear him. He couldn't hear us. And I thought maybe since he was dog sitting, the dog had probably eaten his headphones or something. I don't know. So, hey, before we do move on, and Ed, you got some stuff to talk about there. I did want to just talk about the elephant in the room real quick, not to bring everybody down, but everybody knows it's public, right? Satya sent an email out this morning, rumors yesterday that Microsoft is letting roughly 10,000 people go within the next quarter, right? Next month or so. So for those that, aren't with us or whatever, I just want to send out, just give people just some support, and for, it's tough, and the things that are going on right now. I've been talking to people all day. You kind of hear things here and there, but, it's just kind of sad moment for those folks that, won't be with us after this little term here. So I just want to give that out to everyone. So,
yeah. Thanks for saying that, Rod. We gotta help each other out. And if you need to talk to any of us, if you need to talk to your family, your friends, like make sure you reach out and talk to somebody if you mentally need it, right? Don't hold it in. Reach out to somebody for help, regardless if it's this news or anything else. Make sure you reach out and work on that and get the support you need.
For sure. And if you're a listener of the show and you're impacted by this, by all means, we're part of your network. If we do not, we will not ban you. Send us your resumes. Use us. Maybe we have someone that's looking for someone with your particular skill set. Reach out to us and we can upload your resume. We can, so don't suffer in silence, right? It is the nature of how things happen in the world of business. Unfortunate, and I hope everybody that was impacted lands on their feet and continue to do the good work for our cyber or whatever you were doing.
Yeah, there's no shortage of work out there for everybody. I'm sure everybody's going to land on their feet.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Here's a quiz for Brody. Who is this? New T-shirt.
I am not even going to try to guess because I feel like my guess is going to be so
that I've been doing that like all day to people. Say, hey, who's on this T-shirt? And if they can't answer, it tells me exactly who is not watching our compliance videos.
Is it Nelson?
That's Nelson. Yeah.
Oh, it is Nelson. It's a different profile. You would have a Nelson T-shirt.
Yeah, I think so.
I didn't know who this Nelson fella was.
Yeah.
Hey, let me give you guys some insight. So I've been geeking and frustrated, but at the same time, it sort of takes me back to the roots when you're troubleshooting something and you're getting your hands in. So I'm revamping my lab to modernize it all up, right? I'm updating Sentinel, make sure the workbooks, cleaning it up, alerts and everything else. But I do have an on-premise directory structure that I use to test other things like MDI.
Yep.
So all of my servers were running 2012 R2. So I updated everything in place to data center 2022.
Okay. Domain controller in place upgrade?
From 2012 to 2022.
And you can see his video name today. His little book on it.
It's just as easy to build a new one. I don't know. It's DC's.
Well, I am going to build it out because I have a Hyper-V server that has VMs and is one domain controller. And I said, you know what, the physical one, I'll do it. So I did it, and the core services come back up just fine. Takes a minute, throws you off a little bit, reboots, back up, reboot, back up, reboot, and it's back up. But what it did, it broke the MDI and it broke the MDE onboarding. And the sensor started screaming, it throws offline. And I'm like, okay, so it must be something that is snapshot at the time of you deploying the MDI sensor. For our listeners who are not familiar, MDI is Microsoft Defender for Identity, which protects your on-premise directory for type of credential attacks. And MDE is Microsoft Defender for Endpoint, which is part of our XDR, EPP, and endpoint protection. And so when I onboarded that server in the MDE, rather than use Defender for Cloud, and then when I put the MDI sensor, the server was on 2012. When I did it, the service would not start. So what I ended up having to do is reinstall the sensor for MDI, came back up, did not do anything. MDE would not do it.
Okay.
I had to go get the installation package that you can download, then you run it, and then it came up, and it did something interesting. So when I go to my MDE portal or the security.microsoft.com, go to endpoints, there are 2 entries for that domain controller.
Oh yeah, I love the history. Makes sense because 2012 R2 didn't support MDE out of the box. Like, it was not built into 2012 R2. When you move to 2019, it's part of the system, so it makes sense why you'd have to re-onboard.
Yeah, and I knew it didn't run on 2012 because I watched the support matrix, but I made it work, right? Because I think it made you download this.
The old MMA. We have a new agent for 2012 R2 now. Yeah.
Yeah, and I got it to work. So that was interesting. It didn't. 10 minutes troubleshooting, which I'm proud of me. I just threw my hands up and gave up and said reinstall. So that worked. Now, my failure. I've been battling this Cisco Meraki thing for 2 months, and I've given up. I told Cisco Meraki, this little firewall appliance, you win.
Aren't you a certified Cisco expert? Come on.
Yes.
Someone once called Meraki the Fisher Price of networking gear.
I didn't say it. And
I laughed when I heard that one.
It's good for what it does, and I know sort of what the issue is, because once again, doing upgrades, I upgraded my fiber modem, and the way this fiber modem works with extending or connecting to the WAN port, it no likey. So I've tried everything, and the one thing that works is you have to go in and change the addressing of the VLAN that you originally put out. 192.168.0.0. Couldn't get none of this stuff to work. 198 and DHCP wouldn't work. 192.168.1.x, and it works. So even when I set it to factory default, the old paperclip in the back, hold it, watch a video, write a couple KQL scripts, go have a drink, come back, pull it out, it won't reset. So you win. That's okay. My washing machine is sort of off balance anyway.
Put some coasters under it.
Yeah. So without further, that's all I had today, man.
Cool, man.
And without further ado, we have a guest that is first time, but topic would be part of an ongoing, I won't say series. And he's a guest of and friend of Brody. I reprimanded him on being a friend of Brody. I don't ever admit that.
Thank you. I didn't actually know Chris and I were friends, so thank you, Edward. We've elevated from acquaintances and colleagues to friends. So
well, evidently the check cleared, so you're good.
Yeah.
So Brody, would you like to introduce your guest?
You know what? I would love for Chris to introduce himself because he's probably practiced his introduction and does a better job than me. But let me just say I've had the pleasure of working with Chris in a few capacities recently, and he's just been a rock star in these interesting and tough technical challenges that we work on each and every week here at Microsoft. In our
always never a dull moment in Microsoft.
Never a dull moment. And super quick, Chris, like I posted Brian from that project that we were engaging on. He posted an article on the MDE disconnected environment / air gapped environment. Yeah, and I posted that on LinkedIn on Friday, and so we'll put that again in the show notes because we want to promote that, and that's kind of something that Chris and I have been engaged on with recently.
Challenges for sure. Yeah,
it's a challenge. But yeah, go ahead, Chris. Introduce yourself.
Awesome.
Can't wait to.
Yeah, no, I'm Chris Stelzer. I'm a senior technical specialist for Microsoft in the security space. So I kind of live in British Columbia, where Brody is right now. I'm actually on Vancouver Island. So I joined Microsoft, I think, a little over 3 years ago. I'm strictly in the security space. So my kind of background, I always worked in IT. I was a big system center geek. So config man. Mostly service manager. If anybody knows that we actually make a ticketing tool, everybody laughs.
So it's not a ticketing tool. In fact, when Microsoft came to the customers and said, "Hey, what would you like?" We say we want a help desk tool, and they created Service Manager.
Yeah, we're not going head to head with ServiceNow anytime soon with that, but it had a time and place. People who own System Center, ServiceNow was not cheap, so it had its time and place. So I spent a ton of time in System Center, Service Manager, mostly Orchestrator, so doing a lot of automation, doing a lot of SOAR through Orchestrator, PowerShell automation, lots of stuff around Orchestrator. So I've kind of taken the opportunity to pivot my skill sets around Orchestrator and System Center into Sentinel and Logic Apps. So I kind of spend all my time these days playing with Logic Apps, Playbook, Sentinel, SOAR, automation. I think it's just the greatest, most creative asset of IT is to be able to take an idea or a problem somebody has and turn it into life. So I've got lots of playbooks that I've committed to Sentinel's official GitHub we can walk through. And today I kind of wanted to talk a lot about things like managed identities and service principles and best practices around SOAR. Kind of lots of stuff that I get asked from customers around how to work with SOAR tools within the Sentinel and Logic Apps interfaces.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. So, that's a mouthful. Now Kevin warned me. He said, Chris, like you, Brody, is a fast-talking Canadian hustler.
People can slow it down on YouTube afterwards.
So we're going to, he said to manually slow down Chris's speech. He actually said that, which is kind of hilarious. So Rod's our audio and video editor now. So
awesome.
Maybe we can all move in slow motion when Chris talks.
It's like a $6 Million Man episode.
Yeah. Two things, though. First of all, Chris, we're not being rude. If you see us look this way and that way, Twitch, Discord,
no worries.
Stuff, so I'm setting it back up, right? And then the second thing, you actually sound like you're a Canadian. I think Brody's not really Canadian.
I honestly, Kevin was like, I don't know where Brody's from, and I said I'm pretty sure he's from like Tampa or something. So I didn't think you were from Calgary either, to be honest. So
I'm packing. I'm actually from Winnipeg originally, so in the middle of all of the different voice inflections.
I originally saw him on Corner Gas, I think.
That would be pretty cool if I got on Corner Gas.
Yeah, that's my favorite show.
Yeah.
So, Chris, what are you going to enlighten us with the intricate and complex and super sophisticated world of cybersecurity? Are you going to show us your superpower before we admit you to the Justice League or the League of Injustice?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, like security operations and automation, it's the only way we're going to win against threat actors and attackers these days. And, automation has to be focal point of everything we do within security. And, the more I see automation and driving into security, the more we require permissions for things like service accounts and service principals to do things. And what we're seeing lately is a lot of threat actors, abusing these service principles, abusing these things that we're creating in order to make our lives easier. Attackers are against us. So lots of ways to help protect them and lots of things we can get into for sure.
No doubt. It's a fun world out there, Chris, my friend. Absolutely. So I know leading into the topics that you want to talk about, and there's some excellent questions that we had discussed before the show. Yeah. So I know you're working on our SOAR platform. You want to discuss automation, service principles, managed identities, just leading into how these types of capabilities and solutions can help with this overall challenge that we're all confronting today. I'd love to hear it. I think you got some demo, right? We haven't done a demo session.
Oh yeah, for sure. No, I don't do any. Yeah, I would just live in my demo environment for sure. And I learn from doing. So all the stuff that I'm going to show today is stuff that I'm intimately familiar with. And I think when I think about how we used to do things in automation, or how I used to do in the SOAR realm and Orchestrator, is you create these service accounts, and these service accounts need permission to do things. They need admin rights, need PowerShell rights. Eventually, these service accounts become, customers call them Skynet. We just keep giving them more and more permissions to do things, and they become these monolithic entities that scare the hell out of me. And today we have better around doing these things with, much more granular service principles, managed identities. So lots of different ways that we can optimize the security around these things to make automation work better and a little more streamlined.
So give an example of, when you say automation, that seems to be so ubiquitous now that
Yeah.
I speak English fairly well, right? And I know what automation is. But in the realm of security, people say, well, we want to automate it. What what is the value of automating certain aspects of a security job? Maybe it be SOC, maybe
Yeah.
it be just uh, 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 responding to, what do you see as the biggest need for automation to make our lives as humans better? But at the same time, I don't automate myself out of career.
Yeah.
Well, and,
Yeah.
and in that respect, where do you draw the line? Do you
Yeah.
automate everything so you don't know what's going on?
Yeah, my favorite
right?
quote around that is automating nothing is far often better than automating everything. Because organizations that try to just automate everything, you end up with more problems than you started with. So you have to be very selective at what you automate. So, I work with a lot of teams around formulating an automation team's a good idea is design an automation team that solicits feedback from your users. Like, we did this for a large organization quite a few years ago, and they had this team of people, and they had an open form in SharePoint where you could say, I do this task 7 times a week. It takes me 15 minutes to do it every time. What does that equate to as a total? And they would just gather these pieces of information, whether it be from security, HR, finance. It doesn't really matter who's sending these ideas in, and you can curate these ideas and really decide, is it worthwhile for us to do up of automation to help save time? And in security, we know the answer is always yes, because security minutes matter, right? If I'm spending an hour trying to find an answer or 15 minutes to disable a user account, those things are problematic. These threat actors persist in our environments, and inevitably, the longer that they're in the environments, the more damage that they can do. So security is a great way to start with automation for sure.
Oh, we can't hear Brody again. Brody,
oh no!
Once again,
I have it just in case you want
it. From this broad thing and definition of
it.
And you said automation of security things right there. So what I'm trying to do is get right here. Give me some common denominator of automation. I would think anything automation and security around the realm of identity would probably be my thing, because I really cut you off and get yelled at than try to automate something that goes into complex tasks or trying to do anything that requires, a little bit of judgment. Automation is good, but automation doesn't include judgment, because if it quacks like a duck, walks like a duck, swims like a duck, flies like a duck, it's probably not a duck. And why is this duck going out of the way to prove it's a duck? Right?
Yeah.
And a human can't. So what do you believe is worthy of automation that generally lends value to it? And I like automation around identity. What about you?
Yep. Honestly, start small. So a couple episodes ago, you had Andrea talking about this new Sentinel stat module that we had out there that's all around automating the triage process. Because I always get the ask from customers is that's the first thing they want to do is disable a user account or isolate a computer or those types of things around automation. And those are great, but as a security analyst, I need some information before I determine, I should turn that account off, or I should isolate that machine. And gathering that information as part of the triage process is one of my favorite parts of automation. Is let's gather every piece of evidence, the user's devices, their MFA registration, where they're signing in from, everything that we need to know about these users and these computers and everything else. Gather that information so we can decide if taking automation to the next step is what we need to do. So triage is, I think, one of the greatest spots that you can focus on automation within security is, those meaningless tasks that your security analysts do every day, like looking up a mailbox forwarding rule for a user, figuring out whose manager this person is. Those types of things are great candidates for automation because A, there's no user impact on them. We're driving them into the security operations processes. And B, it alleviates all of those meaningless tasks that security really just doesn't want to do. We need to get them far more proactive, right? Hunting and doing response actions. The triage stuff is just not something we want to be doing all the time, over and over and over again.
Great call.
It does that. So, how much automation is true automation, or is it just you do these things and then hand it back over to me? Are you a true fan of 100% autonomous automation?
No, not at all. There's always going to be a human element, right? And I think even when you look at our own cybersecurity platform inside of Microsoft is, security automation from a Microsoft lens is mimicking the ideal steps a human would take. That's when we think about things like automated investigation across our Defender stack, that's what we're doing in that is we're mimicking exactly what a human would do. And we're trying as much as possible to automate the steps that a human would do manually. So, automating everything is just not going to work. I'd love to see it, but in a world where threat actors are all human, we're absolutely always going to have a need for human intervention.
Within the Microsoft security portfolio, and I'm just going to keep it down to maybe two, if it's another one, expand upon it, Azure and M365. Which is your favorite automation technology? Do you find yourself more endeared to automation as part of the Azure infrastructure, 365? And what are those automation products or processes that users can? Because when you say automation, like what do? You just say, computer, automate this. So as I speak into the mouse, how do you automate in M365?
Yeah,
I think you mentioned something about automatic investigation, but expand upon that a little bit for our listeners.
Yeah. So Defender in a nutshell, like our whole E5 security stack and all the Defender products, there's built-in automation. So when I always talk about designing SOAR capabilities and stuff, look at what you already have automated. What is natively built into the platform and the stack that's already doing automation? Because if there's no point in me jumping to creating a custom playbook to automate something if our tools are already doing it. So study your tools closely. A lot of tools have built-in automation across different security platforms. Defender for Endpoint can automatically investigate endpoints. Defender for Office can automatically investigate mailboxes. So think about what that type of automation is doing, and then help augment it with things that maybe are lacking. I use that 80-20 rule with Microsoft all the time, where we get you 80% of the way there. There's always going to be 20% to fill in with your own third-party automation, your own applications, your own processes, and those types of things. So study really hard on what are your tools automating already.
Smart, Chris. Can you guys hear me okay now?
Yeah, I hear you great.
Edward, wonderful.
Just so everybody knows, I just want to be real with everybody. We are kind of having some audio issues. Ed, you're kind of having some there for a little bit. Brody had to log out back in. Chris, you're fine to me, bro.
Right. Okay.
Like he can't hear you, but I think he tuned you out anyway. So.
No, I wouldn't do that. But yeah, Edward, I logged out and logged back in, and that worked. You came through like you were from a robot or something, Edward. I don't know if it's the headsets or if it's the service today. Thanks.
Maybe the service today. Is that okay now?
Maybe. No. I would hop out, hop back in. Yeah,
all right.
All good, buddy.
Hop back.
Yeah, Chris, I'm glad you bring all these topics up. Every customer I'm working with these days is completely short-staffed. They don't have enough people in-house, and they might be in a cost situation where they can't outsource, or they're not. Some customers I work with aren't large enough for like organizations like Microsoft to take on, and when they look at smaller partners, it's just not cost-effective for them to outsource right now, and they're stuck. Right. And so, I know you're well aware of when Andrea first came on and she did the MSTAT demonstration and how that can help automate incident response and help bring only the most appropriate, the lowest hanging fruit, the highest severity incidents to light for individuals in security operations. That's one way of assisting. And like the items that you're talking about today, where what can we do to make sure that we're still including humans in the loop where needed, right? But we're helping reduce just the mass and the noise. Yeah. And I'd love to see what you have in terms of like a demonstration today. But I think overall you probably see that too with customers that you deal with. I'm just going to assume there because it seems to be highly prevalent across most customers we deal with.
Yeah, and to be honest, when we talk about Sentinel and kind of that determining factor, people look at that versus potentially a competitor. We're giving them the promise of automation, and I can tell you. From personal perspective, going to some of these conferences, I talk to a wide range of different types of companies, right? Small, medium, large. They all want the automation, but primarily those, small organizations, right?
Right.
Because they still want to be able to do security, but they have this task list that's this big and their team is this small. So they need to be able to automate that stuff.
Yeah, good point. And not only automate it, but get the guidance on how to automate it, right? Because I think there's like a comic out there where it talks about, just, hey, I'm not putting in the time to automate, work is proceeding. There's a lot of upfront work sometimes with getting the automation right, but then the long-term payoff is much better.
So that's absolutely a great point, because we do in Sentinel, now that Chris is back, we do in Sentinel offer a lot of templates for the automation that people can just kind of enable immediately. And I think a lot of times it's like kid in a candy store, like, I want this one, But the thing is, you have to do the due diligence. You have to spend the time and set and determine what it is absolutely that you need to automate in your environment, and you need to tune it so it fits your environment, because every environment is different. Users work differently. You have different devices, and there's different ways you approach security for all those different things.
Yeah.
Chris, you're back.
Yep.
You have something there that you wanted to?
Yeah.
I love TV versus audio. So anything
for sure. Let's just share screen and let's just dive into it. I mean, because I think when we jump straight to playbooks in Sentinel, people think, this is great. I can do a lot of things within Sentinel and playbooks, but you need to kind of understand the security behind what you're doing, because I far too often see customers create these monolithic service principles without any, idea of how attackers are abusing these things. So traditionally, when we're designing automation, we're interacting with a lot of APIs. Like Graph API is out there. Everybody knows what Graph API is. So when you want to automate something within the Microsoft ecosystem, chances are you're going to automate it through Graph API. Now, automating through Graph API is great. You can do it a lot. The way that you can do it in the past versus the way we recommend doing it today versus service principles versus what we call managed identities is something we really need to keep in mind. And the first thing a lot of organizations and customers hop to is creating service principles. I'm going to create this service principle and give it the permission I need in order for it to do something within the Azure interface, whether it be Graph API, whether it be Defender. So there's a lot of different playbooks. And again, Rod brought it up in the template library. So the first thing customers normally do is create these service principles without really understanding the ramification of what these service principles do. So what customers will quickly do is create an app registration in the Azure portal and give this app registration a bunch of permissions. And you can see in here, it's very, very easy to create a service principle. You give it a bunch of permissions. I quite often see them reusing the same principles over and over and over again. In my case, it's a lab, so I don't really care. But in a production environment, you want to, again, part of the zero trust principle is least privilege. Let's create different service principles with just the unique permissions that they need to do to get their job done. And I'll kind of explain why this is critical. So if I have a service principle, I've gone ahead and created it in Azure, and I've given it a bunch of permissions. And it's very easy to say, here's the service principle. I want to give it permission in the Graph API. I want to give it permission to, modify everybody's user account. So there's lots of different permissions, right? Something as simple as reading mail in all mailboxes, right? You can literally create a service principle that has the ability to read everybody's email. And there's many reasons you want to do this, right? It makes sense in a case where, if I want to figure out, maybe who's got mail forwarding rules in their inbox, this might be a permission that I need in order to accomplish that. But what's happening is users aren't understanding the ramifications of these very, very serious and dangerous service principles. Because in order to interact with a service principle, we need a secret. So I would come in here and create my service principle, give it the permissions I need, and then come under certificates and secrets and generate a secret that I would then use in my automation tool. So the way this works is, you generate a secret here or credential, and that secret is used, and now my playbook or my automation can interact with this principle and now do whatever permission the principle has. Now, here's where attackers are abusing these principles. If we look back at a lot of examples, the SolarWinds is a great example where once attackers breached a customer's environment, they weren't using interactive identities to conduct recon and do their damage. What they basically did was hop into Azure with an admin account and figure out what service principles exist that have the permissions that this attacker might need. So if I'm a threat actor and I breach someone's Azure environment, I'm not looking for identities anymore. I'm looking for applications. I'm looking for an application that potentially has the ability to read everybody's email. That's a great example, exactly what happened in the SolarWinds case. And what those threat actors then do is they figure out who owns the applications, right? Because I created this application in Azure, I'm the owner of it. I own this application. And if you own an app, you have all the permissions you need to regenerate or create a new secret on that service principal. And that's a difficult thing for a lot of customers to understand, because when we think of permissions in the traditional sense, it's I'm a user, I'm Chris Stelzer, I don't have any permission to do anything, but the service principal I own does. So it's a little bit of a hop, whereas if a threat actor breached my account, even if I had no permission to anything in Azure, I had no permission to anything, but I own this app. That is all an attacker needs. They could get into my account, they could hop into this application, and they could generate a new secret and then use this principal to conduct their operations, which is exactly what happened in SolarWinds.
That's hilarious. Even if you're in a situation where you've got no privileges, you need to elevate when needed, and we've done all of that, just enough access, just in time access through PIM, etc. Still, if you're an app owner, you can generate the secret and use that as leverage to get in.
Exactly. And there's literally PowerShell toolkits online that do recon. There's a Azure AD recon toolkit, and literally one of the commandlets is find out all the applications that are owned by who, and find out what permissions they have, because that is exactly the type of lateral movement that's taking place within customers' Azure environments, is find what apps are out there, find the one that has the permission I need, find out who owns it, and let's go fish that person. Because once I fish them, I can generate a new secret. So if you take away anything from this session today, is do you have proper logging and auditing on the changes that are happening with these service principals? That is so critical today. So a quick test that you can do in your Azure environment, whatever you're doing from a security perspective, logging perspective, SIM perspective, is completely agnostic. Just go into an existing application, generate a new secret, and then delete that secret. So you can literally come in here and just say, generate a new secret, call it, delete me, give it a, whatever retention period, and then just go ahead and delete it. And see who asks questions. See who in the security team asks a question as to what occurred. Because in most customers' cases, they do not have proper logging and auditing around changes that are made to these service principals. And that's the number one thing, is figure out what principles you own, figure out who owns them, and put in some proper logging and auditing around these things.
So now, Chris, outside of logging and auditing, what's the prevention mechanism in the first place? So we need to have an owner of an application. Right? So other than being a bit more reactive on logging and auditing, which is still important, is there a proactive step that we can take to remove the ability to perform this ad hoc if they have an identity compromise?
I mean, it's definitely just do constant proactive inventory of your app registrations and your service principals. Figure out who owns them. Put some strict controls around them. We can do really cool things. We have a platform called, conditional access for workload identities. We have a brand new Azure AD Premium SKU dedicated for service principals. So you can now wrap conditional access around these service principals. So even if a threat actor did get in and generate a new secret, if I have conditional access policies that says this principal can only be used from these IPs or from a trusted device, there's ways that we can prevent them, even if an attacker did get in, from using them in certain scenarios.
Smart. Thank you. Go ahead.
Can you guys hear me a little bit better now?
Yeah.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Maybe because it's storming out here. But let me ask you this question. A service principal is, not directly synonymous with the old school service account.
Service account, you got it. Yeah.
But
very similar.
Very similar. Cloud-based managed identities. My thing is, there are a lot of identity protections that are starting to become just standard out of the box for Azure AD, rather than you happen to go and enable it. Is it the same that when you create an identity and you use an Azure Active Directory identity protection, can service principals be included in those policies of some sort?
You bet.
Or should there be some different?
Yeah, just like we can wrap conditional access around a service principal, we can do risky-based sign-ins for service principals. We introduced that around the Ignite timeframe. So there's a new SKU you need. You actually have to pay for a license for each service principal. It's like, right, because we have Azure AD Premium, you need a license to do conditional access. Now there's a different license that you actually need to put a license on your service principals in order to use risky-based sign-ins for those service principals and things like that. So
the licensing has to be equivalent to a human licensing. It's like
Yep.
E5 or P2.
Yeah. It's a AAD P2 we call it a workload identity license. So it's a new license. Basically, if you just Google workload identities in Azure, you'll see all the documentation around it. Yeah. So we're treating them as workload identities, whether it's a service account, service principal, a managed identity. These are all what we consider as workload identities is kind of the new term we're using for it.
So the service principals, monitoring the service principals. I know it looks like you're going to show these.
Yeah, for sure.
Templates, but is that enabled automatically as
not
default
at all?
when you?
Okay. Yeah. So these analytic rules out of the box for Sentinel are where I would recommend every customer go, because Sentinel is free. We have free data sources for things like the Azure audit logs. And guess what? All of those changes to service principals come from. They come from the audit log. So you can turn Sentinel on for free. You can create log analytics. You can, ingest your Azure audit logs for free, no cost. We're at literally no cost so far, and turn on the analytic rules around service principal monitoring at no cost. So great way for you to get into Sentinel, POC it. And we have all of these analytic rules. If you just go under Sentinel, under rule templates and search for service principal, you'll actually see the critical ones. And, funny enough, we bolstered all of these analytic rules right after SolarWinds, right? Because historically, we didn't see attackers going after these things as much as they do now. So now there is, we even introduced near real time, right? Because it's so critical. If someone goes in and generates a new secret on a service principal, you don't want to wait 24 hours before that incident gets thrown in Sentinel. So we introduced new real time, near real time, which is what the NRT means, around service principals. So I've got one in here for the first credential is added or a new credential is added. And I haven't tested this one, but hopefully very, very quickly you will see authentication methods have changed for privileged account. That's a different one, but very, very shortly we should see an incident come in here around those service principal changes that went through the environment. So new secret was added to a service principal, that will generate an incident, and then you can go in and review the secret that was generated, whether or not it was valid, and those types of things. This is for your own service principals. This is for ones that you create as an organization that you manage the secret on. There's also a whole nother world of third-party service principals, or what we call OAuth applications. And if we think about, I can create my own and give it permission. Your customers and employees can also authorize third-party ones to do very, very similar things. I mean, I use the iOS Mail app as a good example. Like today, in order to check your email on an iPhone, that's an application in Azure AD that's called iOS Mail, and it grants the iOS Mail app the ability to read your email. So there's tons of third-party ones that we're starting to see now where you don't generate certificates and secrets on those, but you still absolutely need to be concerned, because if someone in your org consents to an application that gives this third-party app the ability to read everybody's email, it could be a bad day if that vendor was compromised. What we're seeing a lot now is consent phishing. So threat actors building their own service principals in their own Azure tenants and phishing users with them to get users to click on the link and say, yeah, sure, I consent this app to read my email or read my OneDrive. So we're seeing a lot of rise in consent phishing and tons of abuse of service principals. And I just don't feel like people are looking at these as closely as they should. It's just the number one thing that I see as a big security concern for a lot of organizations.
Other than OAuth consent, which was,
I
think we talked about it last year.
Great.
That, OAuth consent is the new fish.
Yep.
How do you prevent, or is it possible to create unauthorized service principals within an environment by virtue of an attack scenario? All right. I mean, you got to go in, you got to register the app, you got to give it permissions, you have to create the secret. Is it something that can be automated in an attack, or does it have to be very deliberate?
No. I mean, assuming the person has the ability to create applications, and obviously the permission required to delegate, the API permissions and stuff. That's why it's critical to, again, monitor when a new service principal is created, when no credential was previously present. Like that's an example of where you'd want proactive monitoring. If someone goes in and creates one, gives it permission, generates a new secret, that is ultimately where you would want to go. It is proper monitoring and auditing around that.
Your scenario sounds as though it could be isolated to someone who is an Azure consumer, but let's just assume they're not an M365 consumer. So they would probably need to deploy Sentinel and analytic rules to be able to capture this. One of the products that I'm a fan of, still am, Microsoft Cloud App Security or Microsoft Defender for Cloud Apps. It catches this type of activity.
You bet. Yeah, we have rogue OAuth applications, OAuth apps that look like Microsoft apps that contain words similar. We also developed a whole app governance platform, like an entire something is a security concern when Microsoft develops an entire product with a new SKU dedicated to this particular thing. And this is OAuth applications. Like the app governance suite is designed to do that, not just, monitor whether these service principals are created, but also behavioral patterns. So if you use a service principal that reads everybody's email, like I use like the Proofpoint one's a good example. They have a one that's called Trap. It's an OAuth app that gives Proofpoint the ability to reach into a mailbox and remove email as like a post-breach defense utility. But what if that service principal's doing things it's never done before, right? It starts reading other people's emails or jumping into CFO's mailboxes and reading their email. So, monitoring the behavior of these service principals, what's normal and expected versus all of a sudden it's doing something we've never seen before. That's what, our app governance platform within Defender for Cloud Apps was designed to do as well.
So the black hat in me manifested just now. So let's talk about insider risk.
Yeah.
What's to prevent Chris from going in and creating these service principals to read the CFO's mailboxes, see all of these things?
Yep.
You have to assume that the old days of the bad guys coming in this way no longer is the absolute truth. Sometimes the threat is this way: insider risk, purview, and all this other stuff.
Yep.
How do we guard against that type of stuff when someone goes in? This seems pretty basic to do. I want to be able to get everybody's mailboxes. I don't want to do it up on my login contact. I create a service principal, have it read, and then have that mail forwarded over. And it's licensed, so it looks like it's a person. Is that something that should also be considered?
I mean, the line between an external threat actor and an internal one is so blurred these days. Like, the way these threat actors are operating once they're in an environment is employees. So, I don't scrutinize between what's external and what's internal. From a security operations standpoint, is proactively monitor, assume breach, assume whether it's an internal or an external threat actor, they're going to be malicious. Like if you just take that stance of just assume they're already in our environment, you need to focus a lot more on proactive monitoring. So whether it's a external threat actor who's creating the service principal or a malicious employee, it doesn't really matter. As long as those proactive monitoring and alerting is in place, that's where we need to be, for sure.
So how does managed identity service principals fit into the new buzz phrase, zero trust?
Yeah. So if we think about, the old way of doing things around like what I showed you, service principals and secrets, anytime you have to create a secret, there is a chance for abuse. And it becomes a lot more difficult to control, who generated the secret, or, who has access to the secret and those types of things. So in a particular scenario where we can use what are called managed identities from a SOAR perspective, we can actually do very, very similar SOAR operations without having to manage secrets at all. And managed identities has evolved over the years. Historically, it was limited in what we could do with managed identities. But nowadays, you can absolutely do a lot more with managed identities in the fact that, I don't have to create a service principal and secrets. I can use managed identities. So I want to kind of talk a little bit about, the differences between what I showed you from a service principal and what we like to see a lot more with what we call managed identities.
Okay.
So yeah, managed identities in a nutshell is, they're a different way of creating similar to a service account or a service principal, but the benefit is you don't have to manage credentials, right? This is the absolute benefit of using a managed identity over a service principal is you don't have to manage the credentials for it. Microsoft and the Azure platform does it all for you. You can't see what the credential is, and the credential can, essentially live with the life cycle of the resource. So there's two ways to create managed identities. There's a system assigned one and a user assigned one. So system assigned is similar to the service principal idea that we can create a universal managed identity that I use everywhere across my environment. Or we can create a user assigned one that acts as a standalone Azure resource. So from a playbook perspective, and I'm going to hyper focus on Sentinel and how managed identities are used, is historically we create a playbook within Sentinel. It's a logic app, and that logic app has to do something, right? And I'll bring the sort of stat module up as an example. So, we talked about MStat a few episodes ago. If you haven't, go back and listen to it. But it uses the concept of managed identities within it to do these SOAR operations. So what you basically see when you install the MStat module is it comes with a PowerShell script that is used to give permissions to all of the different managed identities that exist within this particular solution. You can see it comes with, I think, like 8 or 9 different what we call logic apps. Each one of these logic apps actually has a managed identity associated with it. So it's very, very easy to, create a managed identity with your logic apps in question. You can just basically bring up a logic app inside your environment. So I'm just going to pull up logic apps as an example. And just show you an example of a logic app. Within that logic app, and I can bring up one of the MStat ones, is there's this notion of creating an identity in here. So you actually are basically saying, I want this logic app that is called Get MDE Insights to become a managed identity. So I'm not provisioning an identity. I'm not provisioning a secret. I'm not provisioning a credential. I'm simply saying, I want this logic app to become a system-assigned managed identity. And now that this has become a managed identity, I can give it permissions. I don't have to maintain or manage secrets at all anymore. I can simply use delegated permission models to give this managed identity permissions. And this is exactly what this PowerShell script that comes with the MStat module is designed to do. Is it's designed to basically give each of these logic apps the permissions they need, or each of the managed identities. So in the case of the Get MDE Insights, you can actually look down, they've developed a function in here, but you can see specifically around the MDE module, which is Defender for Endpoint, actually needs 4 permissions and a role in Sentinel. And this PowerShell does just that. It's basically giving this managed identity the permissions it needs. It's giving it user read all, it's giving it machine read all, and it's giving it the role of Sentinel responder. So rather than me using this monolithic service principal, giving it tons of permissions, I'm basically taking each logic app that I want to do SOAR with and turning that into a managed identity and giving it the granular permissions it needs to do in order to do its job. So it's a little more complicated than using a single service principal for everything. But the idea here is that we can natively use this managed identity within a logic app. And quite often you do this all the time with SOAR. Storing stuff in Key Vault is a good example of where you might want a managed identity. You can store your secrets in Key Vault within Azure, and you use a managed identity to retrieve those secrets. Right. There's lots of different ways that you can do that for sure.
That's smart. This reminds me, just being like in an on-premise Active Directory environment, similar to your group managed service account.
Yeah.
This is important segregation, right? We're just giving just enough access to these identities, but we're not managing the secrets within them, or like we did back on Active Directory days, we're not having to deal with the password expiry and all that interactive login stuff. It just makes sense to have this set up on a one-to-one basis where needed.
Yeah. So in the case of this logic app has to pull a key out of Key Vault. I give the managed identity access to Key Vault, and I use an API call within a logic app. And down here from authentication, I simply say managed identity. That's it. I don't have to put a password in here. I never need to manage secrets. And when I delete, this is my favorite part, is when you delete this logic app, the managed identity goes with it. So you're never left with like service accounts that don't do anything anymore. If once I delete this workflow, the managed identity goes along with it, and it's just a far more effective way. So not only do you have to manage secrets, no more secret management, much more granular permission, but the managed identity lives with the resource throughout its life cycle.
That's awesome.
So Chris, help me if I'm misremembering this, because I was Azure, introduction heavy, and then M365 and sitting on all this other stuff. But wasn't there a point or time, and I haven't seen it, maybe it's somewhere else, that when you used to create these secrets and manage identities, they had non-expiring parameters. Now it seems like they will expire you after 2 years, regardless of what you're setting. Is that the case now, that you cannot create an unexpiring secret / attached to a managed identity service principal?
No, I don't. So managed identities, it manages the secret automatically on the back end. So it automatically renews it. I can't remember what the cadence is, but you don't need to be bothered with that at all anymore. When you use a managed identity, you just use it within the Azure interface and the Azure environment, and it automatically retrieves the secret and uses it within the environment. There's no need to manage secrets. I think from a traditional service principal perspective, I think you can still create a secret with no expiry. I haven't tried it in a while. Potentially, if I went and created a new secret, looks like 24 months maybe is the limit. So, but creating secrets that don't expire, a huge cause for concern, right?
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
So let's talk about it. Let's talk about the SolarWinds thing and backtrack a little bit. This is super interesting because you're starting to see more automation and managed identities and API secrets and access based on certain roles. So if we look at the SolarWinds fiasco, I'm trying to frame the question right. When you look at managed identities, is it and all or nothing, or is there let me change it this way. If I got to a service principal, is there a way to escalate the privilege of the service principal / identity, or you keep looking till you find one that's privileged enough to do the nasty things that you've talked about with the environment?
Yeah. I mean, threat actors they're looking for the ones that are privileged enough that they have the access to, right? So
those custom roles, right? So it's those custom roles, and I saw the custom role created there. Is there a dictionary somewhere? Because creating custom roles sometimes can be just as difficult as anything else, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
You saw with that Defender stuff there, the custom roles. How do you know you have too much, right? Where is that reference that you can look at?
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult, especially when we get into API permission. So what I like to do from an API permission perspective for that sort of dictionary of what's possible is, just create your own service principal, and, or again, our Graph API documentation is really good. Anywhere we have an API, we generally have pretty good documentation, but you can absolutely browse the list of APIs that are available out there. If you just create a service principal as an example, I can now browse everything that's possible. Like I can search for, Defender as an example. I think we call it still Windows Defender Defender ATP. And I can say, here's a dictionary of every possible permission that I could give it from an API perspective. So rather than you giving it, full administrative rights, give it only the individual API permissions your managed identity needs to do its job, and this is why I always bring up MStat, because that's exactly what it's doing. Could we get away with giving it all the permissions to Defender? Absolutely. But we know this playbook is only doing a very few things. It's looking at KQL, it's reading computers, and it's, reading people's mailboxes for mailbox forwarding rules. So we're giving it very granular permissions. So kind of browsing the API database around those gives you a good idea of how, and this changes so fast, right? So, get familiar with everything that's in here so you really know how granular you can get.
It sounds like the versatility of managed identities and secrets and stuff is a liability, because can you use traditional identity management by putting them in role groups?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, but again, where are you going to put the password for that? If I have a logic app, the last thing you want to do is hard code a password in a logic app that uses a standard user account. That is just an extremely bad practice, right?
Or I just put it in a config file of that.
Yeah, or just get something on your desktop. Whereas
in plain text.
Yeah. And this is why I absolutely love logic apps, and Sentinel are a match made in heaven, because as soon as you take the SOAR platform out of the SIM, then you got a problem, because all my data and everything I want to interact with is in Azure and Office 365, but my SOAR platform is over here with Palo Alto. Then that becomes problematic, because you have to manage credentials and the communication between them, whereas Sentinel and logic apps are in the same environment. Graph API, Office APIs, they're all in the same environment. So managed identities, it's just so much easier keeping your SOAR, your logic apps, and your SIM, Sentinel, in one contained environment.
That's why they love you on sales calls, Chris.
And I know I'm coming in and that's the majority of the question, but I'm super interested in this. It's pretty cool, because how it works, but you don't know how it works. We know the buzzwords. So when you look at this from a Sentinel perspective, how do you write detections that look for that? I know what I want to ask. One of my favorite features in Sentinel is Yuba. Does this managed identities manifest as abnormal behavior as though a regular user would inside in entity behavior analytics?
Yeah, so today we don't do UEBA for managed identities. I mean, I think that's a really cool idea. Just like we do, it's similar to how app governance works, right? App governance in Defender for Cloud Apps is like UEBA for service principal. So you're right. I think we need a little bit more behavioral analytics. One thing that I like to do is just do some dashboards with KQL around managed identities. So there's an example where, extract sign-in logs and operation logs around your managed identities, so you can understand, here's a managed identity called run KQL query. I know what it's doing, where it's authenticating from, what command it's running in the audit logs, to really study whether or not this is normal or abnormal behavior for that managed identity.
Yeah, one rule we have here: you can't show the goodies without sharing. Is that workbook really available for anybody that's running?
No, I don't have this one published particular, but it's very, very simple from a sign-in logs perspective, because we didn't cover it, but obviously we've bolstered the sign-in logs around managed identities extensively. Like, that was part of our push, was to really get this data in there around minimizing the blind spots. So after SolarWinds happened, we basically beefed up our audit and logging to introduce a whole host of new tables within log analytics to start monitoring for service principal sign-ins, managed identity sign-ins. So all of this new data is available in new tables within log analytics. You just have to kind of turn it on. And then you can basically just generate all the workbooks you want around these things. In this case, there's just two tables that I'm looking at here: AAD service principal logs joined with managed identity logs. So just two different tables that I'm using to basically pull that logging data into a workbook and allow me to kind of see what service principals and managed identities are doing across the different auditing logs within my environment.
Okay. Cool. Hey, Chris, so I don't know if this is possible, but earlier you were touching on determining exactly which permissions a managed identity would need to perform its task, right? Yeah. So let's say, it's got and I'm just making things up on the fly here, a read, another read and a write permission to various aspects of this application or this, whatever it may be. Is there a way to check how often a managed identity would actually leverage that permission, so that you can start okay, we've got all this set up, but now we really want to lean into just enough access principles. So can we find out, hey, did that app really need those 5 permissions, or can it get away with 3? Is there a way of doing that?
It's a tough one for sure. And I mean, I think just, monitoring the audit logs, understanding kind of, what the service principal is doing, right? What it's accessing, what resource it's accessing. The trouble is a lot of the audit logs are spread out. Like, if I have a service principal that is making changes to or isolating computers in MDE, I'm not going to really know, from a logging perspective, how that server or managed identity is doing those things. Where would I look to find that? I'd have to go into the Defender for Endpoint environment and try to figure out from an auditing log perspective, where that managed identity did those things. So in many cases, like making sure you're kind of pulling all of your audit logs from the different applications into one environment. So, you can track, what was called from where and when, but it becomes problematic for sure because, API permissions are Graph, Office 365, Defender, they're all over the place. And those audit logs are not necessarily in one spot, which absolutely can be problematic.
Thank you.
Well, educate me on how managed service principles work. Can they be exposed and abused through something around B2B or B2C?
Yeah, so managed identities work best. Obviously, they only work in a contained Azure environment where you have a service like Graph API and a logic app which exists in Azure. Those two things talk to one another is a great use case for managed identities. Those have obviously less of prevalence for abuse because there's no certificates, no secrets to manage. It's a lot more difficult for a threat actor to get access to those managed identities and those things. Whereas service principals, they can be used anywhere, right? That's why it's critical from a service principal perspective that you have things like conditional access wrapped around those things. So if a threat actor got a hold of a service principal, generated a new secret, all I need is that secret, that client ID and that secret, and I can use that service principal anywhere on the planet. Like I could use it from a different country and those types of things. So ensuring you have proper conditional access rules around those service principals to ensure that if the secret does get out, there's a lot more walls around those service principals.
And once again, I'm asking questions. It's actually super interesting about it because my mind is churning like, oh my God, I could use it this way. How about this route? Tell me if this is possible, or if you've never heard this.
Yeah.
It looks like it's a service account, but it's a managed identity. There's some nuances that are very deliberate because it is in the cloud. But how is this affected with synchronization between an on-premise directory? Are those excluded? Or just something you need to take into account in excluding doing your synchronization? Or could I jump from Active Directory, a compromised Active Directory environment, see these things inside the AD Connect, whatever that thing, and then jump over?
Yeah, you wouldn't see them, they don't synchronize back to on-prem or anything. But again, that's what we're seeing threat actors do is once they compromise an on-prem AD account, they are after Azure, right? They're going to Azure. So if that on-prem AD account is synchronized to Azure AD and that threat actor gets into Azure AD, then they will set their sights on those service principals, trying to find the service principals that they need in order to conduct their operations.
So let me ask another question. Are you guys having difficulty hearing me again?
Yeah,
a little bit. I don't know how Chris is understanding you.
I
read lips effectively.
I think you guys are giving Chris too much credit. I'm using force. I'm just sending it to him through my mind.
Yeah, so I think we should all let's test Chris's ability, his skills. Let's just all mute and start talking and see if he can answer.
I'm not that good.
I'm sorry. I apologize to our listeners. I have no idea what's going on.
Yeah, no worries. But yeah, use managed identities first wherever possible. If the use case fits a managed identity, it just makes sense. Two, if you have to use a service principal, with a secret, make sure you have proper logging and auditing turned on. Make sure all the new tables that log sign-in activity, those types of things, risky workload identities, make sure all that data is in your SIM as well.
Yeah. Thank you. I think this is super informative. I love KQL and I love these workbooks, but do you have, before we kind of have to close out here, do you have some kind of analytics rule to tell when people have more than 100 browser tabs open?
It's not bad.
I do not.
You know what?
That's not bad. That's not bad.
You can kind of read the first letter of each. I talk to people and it's like half the icon of the Microsoft logo on the learning page because they.
So I do the vertical tabs. That way I can read everything. So I literally have so many open.
I switched recently. You get these large widescreen monitors, and I was like totally against like edge collections and vertical tabs. Like, don't tell me how to use a browser. But I started using them, Rod, and actually it helps. It helps a lot.
You have to put them out of the way when you do demos. But other than that,
yes,
absolutely. There is a way you could write a little bit of a PowerShell script to go look at one single tab open and then look inside task manager and the amount of resources used. You just extrapolate it, right? Like if it uses this amount and that's this amount, Rod has 120 tabs open. There you go.
You can see all my analytic rules did trigger on the creation and deletion of that secret. So, I mean, that's the easiest test you can do. Just hop in, find one, create a secret, delete it, see if your security team says anything. And if they don't, clearly there's no logging and auditing at play here.
Thank you. And the article you posted earlier, I know it was a 2021 article.
Yes.
It's still relevant. We'd still like to.
So relevant.
Great. We'd like to put that in the show notes and promote that because we want to make sure everybody knows that this is obviously the method that people should be implementing moving forward.
Like what you'll notice in the article, again, this was when we started to release a lot of new tables. There's way more. Like if you go into the Azure AD connector in Sentinel now, there's an extra 5 or 6 tables we've added with more and more data. So everything in this article is so critical, but just feel free to introduce even more tables to get more data inside your environment.
Thank you. That's awesome. Rod, did you want to quickly touch on that announcement or talk about the Learn article before we go?
Yeah, Chris, if you want to jump over to incidents, open one of those incidents up, go to full detail. Well, let's get something. Yeah, you've got plenty of entities.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
So, I just want to mention this. This is something that kind of been touching on for a little bit with the product team. This is brand new. This is actually rolled out to our customers overnight, right? We had a webinar about this yesterday. This is the new incident experience. This is super awesome. This has been in the works for a while, and absolutely needed customers have requested us to do something different because the information, the way it was displayed, was just inefficient. And if you know me, that's my huge OCD. If it's inefficient, I hate it. I'm not even gonna deal with it. But there's a lot to this. I think everyone should kind of check this out. This gives you a lot of capability. You never have to leave the incident blade anymore. You go to your activity logs. You can open up tasks. You can
run playbooks on individual accounts or hosts. There's a welcome addition for sure. Yeah,
it used to be an analyst would have to open multiple tabs with the console. Hey, I need to do some enrichment. I'm going to go do a query. Click logs. It just pops up in a display.
Yeah.
So it's pretty awesome.
Yeah, and the activity log has kind of changed a lot. If you'll notice in the new one, it's in a different window, kind of off to the side. One of the caveats that I realized in testing, and I've been pinging the PGs around a fix, is anytime you're embedding hyperlinks, and the MStat module does just that. I'm not going to cover this in detail, but if you're embedding hyperlinks in the new activity pane, your URLs have to specify a source. This was a minor bug that that the PGs are not going to fix. We just need to make sure that when we're putting comments in the new activity pane, you have to specify a source, or it'll actually open within the activity pane, which is no good. It'll wipe it out.
A couple of things I've heard complaints already is, number one, it doesn't support inline images anymore. The second one is, if you open the logs blade or the logs window, you can't open a second tab to do multiple queries now. So they're kind of looking for that. So that's okay.
I mean, I think it's a welcome addition for sure. Having everything organized, having similar incidents, all these top insights on the right around, UEBA queries, and is this an operation that this person's done before? Is there many matching threat intelligence indicators? A lot of this data is now right in the front of what we need from a security operations perspective.
So before we go, I'm going to try my best to get one clear question out. This is in the chat.
And it sounds good.
You sound good now.
My wife must have been downloading the internet. Who knows? So
probably taco recipes.
How did you know she's cooking? Anyway, can the app service running under a managed identity act on behalf of a user, and email pops up, and the user signs into a protected web app, calls a protected API, aka app service? Would the app service have details about the logged in user and their claims if the web app has used claims transformation?
Yeah, that's a tricky one. I mean, I don't think that would be a managed identity would never act on behalf of a user, but a service principal would. Like, you can give a service principal what we call delegated permissions. So that service principal does act on behalf of the user. And that's trying to understand the difference between delegated permission and application level permissions within service principals is a whole topic in itself. But absolutely, if you had a service principal with delegated permissions and a user attempts to use that service principal, you would have all the information about that user within that particular service principal access.
And that's what I thought based on my limited exposure to it most of the time is
Yeah.
messing with Lighthouse and then getting access to managed identities because of MSSP or something wants permission to a certain role group or something. That's my exposure to using it. This has been highly informative.
Yes.
Yeah, I could talk all days on this stuff for sure.
Well, if we can get a part 2, we'll bring you back.
Oh yeah.
And continue through this.
We have to run it by Andrea first.
She'll be all right.
Andrea's making sure we have informative and interesting guests, Chris. And if she was here, I think she'd be like, "Oh yeah, he nailed it. Let's get that guy back on." So thank you very much for coming on and showing us this, and thank you to everybody who's listening and watching. We think there's something up with something, and that's what's been affecting our audio and streaming capabilities today. So thanks for sticking with us. And Edward was asking some amazing questions. Chris got all of them somehow and was able to answer them. So it was great teamwork overall.
That was awesome. That's the best part.
I sent it to him in advance. Like, there you go.
Made for good
Chris,
TV.
if you're ever in the South,
Yeah.
South meaning Georgia, look me up, man. Take you for a beer if I'm ever up your way. Vancouver, right?
Yeah, I think I'm on Vancouver Island. I'm kind of small community right on the ocean. Yeah.
That's where all the rich people live.
My dad lives near the airport, Chris, like 10 minutes away from the airport. Whereabouts on the island?
So I'm mid, sort of, we call it North Island, but I'm in Comox. It's a very, very small town, kind of, east side of the island.
Cool. Well, next time I go hassle him, and maybe I'll invite you up too.
Yeah,
Cool.
yeah, for sure.
We can go fishing and bear hunting.
Oh yeah.
Yes, bear hunting. Yes, Edward. That's the first thing we're going to do when you come up here. Bear hunting.
Bear wrestling. That's what it is.
Bear wrestling.
Yeah. Thank you
guys
for coming
know
on, Chris.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much, Chris.
Yeah.
Is there anything else we need to do before we go here, Rod? You going to learn?
That's it. To our listeners, I think we're going to supply the links to our Learn modules and some docs that we supplied for Microsoft Sentinel, and we'll include that in the show notes. And for our listeners and our watchers, it's been another great week. Chris, appreciate it. And we will see you all next week.
No problem. Thanks, everyone.
See you next week. Thank you, Reactor. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.